Dear students, today we will learn about reproduction in flowering plants. This process begins with the development of the male gametophyte, also known as the pollen grain. Inside the anther of a flower, there are pollen sacs called microsporangia. These sacs contain many diploid microspore mother cells. Each microspore mother cell undergoes meiosis and produces 4 haploid microspores. Each microspore then undergoes mitosis and develops into a pollen grain. A mature pollen grain contains 2 cells, a tube cell and a generative cell. The tube cell later forms the pollen tube, while the generative cell divides to produce 2 male gametes, or sperms. The next step is pollination, which is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a flower. Pollination may be self-pollination, where pollen is transferred to the stigma of the same flower or another flower on the same plant, or cross-pollination, where pollen is transferred from one plant to another plant of the same species. After pollination, the pollen grain lands on the stigma and begins to germinate. The tube cell forms a pollen tube that grows through the style toward the ovary. The pollen tube enters the ovule through a small opening called the micropyle. At the same time, the generative cell divides to form 2 sperms, which travel through the pollen tube to reach the embryo sac. Fertilization takes place when the pollen tube reaches the ovule. One sperm fuses with the egg cell to form a diploid zygote, which later develops into an embryo. The second sperm fuses with the fusion nucleus to form a triploid nucleus. This triploid nucleus develops into a tissue called the endosperm, which provides nourishment to the developing embryo. Since 2 fusion events occur during this process, it is called double fertilization. Double fertilization is a unique characteristic of flowering plants, also known as angiosperms. After fertilization, important changes occur inside the flower. The zygote develops into an embryo, while the endosperm provides food for its growth. The ovule matures and becomes a seed, and the ovary develops into a fruit. When seeds are dispersed and receive suitable conditions such as water, air, and proper temperature, they germinate. The embryo grows into a seedling and eventually develops into a mature flowering plant called a sporophyte. In this way, the life cycle of a flowering plant is completed and continues from one generation to the next. Students, remember that pollen grain is the male gametophyte. Pollination transfers pollen to the stigma. Flowering plants show double fertilization. The ovule becomes a seed and the ovary becomes a fruit. Happy learning!